Hello, everybody. Welcome to Adam Makes Beer. My name's Adam, and this is the February 2024 Industry Pro interview. And today we're going to be sitting down with Julien Shrago of Beachwood Brewing. Very excited about today's chat. So let me get through channel news and a little live read, and we'll get to this conversation. Adam Makes Beer is now a podcast. Check out Spotify, Apple Podcast, and see all of the long-form brewer interviews we've done. After you subscribe, please leave a review and comment as well, because it really helps support the work I'm doing. If you are new to the channel or podcast, go to Adam Makes Beer on YouTube, click the playlist tab to see tons of information, full brew days, technique videos, tutorial videos, now over 600 videos total on YouTube. And please comment, share, and do all the things that you do with online content that you like. Share it with your brewing friends and craft beer enthusiast homies. And if you have the means and feel as if my content has benefited you, consider a channel membership for $2.99 a month. It gives you priority for Q&A live stream questions and quarterly merch drawings. If you are able, consider a super chat tip in the comments or chat. I also have new merch. I have a new coffee mug up. This is not the one people that I've watched before are familiar with. The Brew Daddy mug that my children gave me. That is the #1 selling item, disturbingly, in the Adam Makes Beer merch store. Don't get me wrong, I appreciate it, but that's an interesting one. I've got a new mug. By the way, I tried to buy one of the new mugs. It's the four elements of beer logo that you've seen floating around my stuff. I have a mug for that. It's an all black mug with that white logo on it. It's really sharp. And I do have a new t-shirt, multiple colors of the 4 elements Adam Makes Beer shirt. So get in there, show me a little love, and get yourself some sweet merch. Beyond that, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about our lovely sponsor at Blickman Engineering. Blickman Engineering has been the pioneer of nano brewing, and they have helped hundreds of successful breweries achieve their dreams since they started with 1-barrel systems in 2006. Now offering a full suite of brew houses up to 15-barrel skidded and insulated, matching cellaring equipment, keg washers, grain mills, and more sized specifically for the nano brewer. Blickman Pro Brewing systems are competitively priced without sacrificing quality, and the simple design and factory direct support from our brewing experts gets you up and running faster than anything else on the market. When you're ready to go pro or just kicking the tires, be sure to reach out to them for expert advice and a partner to help you through it all. Turn your dreams into a reality by reaching out to Phil, Tom, or Josh at Pro Series at blickmanengineering.com. Again, that's Pro Series at blickmanengineering.com. Blickman Engineering Pro Brewing is proud to be the equipment sponsor for this channel and is committed to helping every brewer, no matter where they are in their journey. As I mentioned before, we are joined by Julien Shrago. Julien, how you doing today, man?
I'm great. Thank you for having me on the show. Excited to be here.
Absolutely, man. You know, we were talking briefly off air, and you mentioned the few things that you do put on social media. It's either beer, guitar, or running. How many miles a week do you put in?
Well, I'm mostly a trail runner. I only do road if it's raining outside and I absolutely have to. But in general, I'm usually around 40 miles a week on the trail.
For sure.
But I'm really lucky that I live up in the hills in East Orange County, and I'm literally across the street from a regional park, a huge regional park with miles and miles of really steep, challenging trails. So I walk across the street and I'm right there.
Nice. Have you been running for long? Is this kind of a lifelong thing for you, or?
No, I didn't start running until I was in my 40s, but I was always active. I was a mountain biker for a long time, and then I got more into hiking and then doing some cross training at the gym. But as I got older, I got a little bit more risk averse, and especially being like a business owner and having kind of key responsibilities that I had to be present for, I became a little bit more risk averse. And then, you know, what was hiking kind of became hiking, and then jogging one section, and then jogging two sections. And it kind of evolved into running for me. So I've been a runner for trail runner for about 7 years.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I started running a little bit later, probably. I think it was when I was 35, and probably one of getting probably one of the heaviest I've been. And then I just decided, well, listen, I'm going to start running, right? Because I realized that at that point I was staring down 40, right? So I decided I was going to get out and start doing some running. And I did it in the worst way possible. Like you just run every day as far as you can, as fast as you can. It was a great program. It was a great program for getting into that activity.
Sure.
But yeah, I ran for a while, and then a few years back, I had to have Achilles surgery, and I'm still not to the point to where I can get cardio on the feet like that. But yeah. Well, that's cool. Is it like, do you feel for you, like, is it a good stress release?
It's 100. Well, for me, it's a necessity.
Sure.
And I'm going to sound a little like probably prescriptive and proscriptive when I say this, but I think whether people realize it or not, their physical health is the most important thing in their life. And I think everything derives from that. So my ability to be present in my marriage, for my business, for my customers and fans, just everything that I do ultimately derives from how I feel physically and mentally. And so it's not just a stress release for me, but it keeps my body in shape.
Yeah.
And it's where I find my zen.
Yeah.
I get on the trail and I get into a rhythm, and then all those complicated pieces that are moving about my head kind of start to fall into place. And that's really where I do some of my best and most productive thinking is on the trail when I get into that rhythm.
That's a beautiful thing, man. And I think you're absolutely correct. There's something to that, right? Like, so just recently I've just gotten back into, so when I stopped being able to run, I started getting into weight training, and I like to get like really nerdy about stuff and really deep dive. And that was one of those things that I really got into, you know what I mean? Like really learning about the physical mechanics of it, and technique, this, that, and the other thing. And just recently I've kind of started back up again, but I'm doing it in a way that's much more appropriate for my age.
Sure.
Because I tend to, because I'm 46 now, but even like when I started back up when I was 45, I started back up like I was 25. You know what I mean? And there's a little bit of there's levels to that. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So, but you're absolutely right though. Like the past few weeks in particular, since I've really been back at it and doing it in a smart way, your body feeling good sets everything in motion for all those other dominoes of your day. Because I think we both had those days where you get out of bed in the morning and you felt you got hit by a truck, right? And then it's kind of just, it can kind of spiral from there. But when I do have the physical side correct, everything else flows so much better.
100%.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, listen, you have most people that I know in the industry did not go directly from high school or directly through, a secondary program for brewing. They had an industry before. So kind of what was your path into the brewing industry?
Well, in my past life, I was a rocket scientist. I was an aerospace engineer for 12 years before I got into professional brewing. But brewing was something that I did in college from the beginning. I went to school in Santa Barbara, UC Santa Barbara in the mid 90s. And there was so much craft beer around me from the very beginning. I was interested in it. I was in love with it. And it was my fall quarter, my freshman year, that one of my classmates mentioned that he homebrewed. I thought that was pretty interesting. So when I came home for the winter break, this is after my fall quarter, my freshman year, I mentioned homebrewing to my parents, and they said, oh, well, there's a store, a winemaking, beer making store in Berkeley just north of where I grew up in Berkeley, California. I grew up in Oakland, and Berkeley is this next city north.
Sure.
And a store called the Oak Barrel. And they took me there and they bought me a homebrew kit. And
Nice.
the guy working behind the counter, his name was Homer Smith. And I think he's still there.
Yeah.
So
I know the name.
Yeah. I think Homer helped hook up Roger Davis. I think Sean O'Sullivan. And the guy is, he also never forgets a face too. Like I hadn't seen him in many, many years. And like every time I've run into the guy, even if there were 5 or 10 years in between when I last saw him, he remembers my face, remembers my name, remembers the times that I came into Oak Barrel. And that's where I started homebrewing in 1996. And I was hooked, but it wasn't something I got into professionally until really we opened Beachwood.
Sure. What do you think how long were you doing the engineering side of things?
12 years. So I did that from 2000 to 2012 with a year of crossover. The first year that we were open at Beachwood in downtown Long Beach, I was still working my engineering job full time and then doing everything at that little brew pub too for the first year.
Yeah. Before I got into professional brewing, I taught at-risk kids for 10 years, and
oh wow,
I felt good. How do I want to say it? I felt good with the fact that I still had something in the tank for it. Unfortunately, I think we've all had, either teachers or managers or bosses that have just done it for too long. And they needed to get out sooner. I was always glad that I didn't hit that point. And I hesitate to say that a little bit because people are like, well, it was only 10 years, but they were pretty intense. It was a pretty intense 10 years. You know what I mean? And it's a little bit, we joke around, it's a little bit like teaching in dog years, but I still had a love for it. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And so I had this pro side opportunity pop up. And so I ended up taking a sabbatical because theoretically that was going to allow me to work in the brewery for a year and then decide what I wanted to do. Right. Well, you and I both know that construction never happened on time. And I actually had to tell them that I was not returning until and the brewery wasn't even open yet. So anyhow, so for you in the engineering field, did you feel like that was something that you were tapping out on from a passion standpoint and just wanted to move on to something else, or did the passion for the brewing industry outweigh the other?
Well, it was a little bit more of the latter. I wasn't burned out on engineering at all. In fact, people ask me, do you miss it? And I get to do it every day because there's so many things, especially in a production facility. There are mechanical processes that are driven by the fundamentals of engineering. And there are so many things that I've worked on and installed and do in the brewery all the time that are related to my engineering. But yes, my passion for brewing was a huge driving factor, but I think more than that, the ability to own my own business, and even bigger than that, the ability to have creative autonomy, to be able to do whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted, without any kind of real limitations, is incredibly fueling for creativity.
Mm-hmm.
And I've almost never found anything that has allowed me to be more creative than owning my own business. And, if I can really do anything that I want. If I want to brew a particular beer, ultimately I'm the one who decides whether or not to do that and what ingredients we're going to use, what style we're going to make. My sales team might hate me for brewing, 100 barrels of ancient brew it, but if I really wanted to do it, I could do it. So if you think about it, if somebody were to say to you, what would you brew today if you could brew anything?
Yeah.
Your creative juices would start flowing a lot more efficiently, I think. So that's ultimately what drives me, is having creative autonomy.
Yeah. What has been the thing that you found? Because this is the first business that you've owned and operated, correct?
Mhm.
What has been? I find taking on new challenges like that can sometimes show us areas or skill sets, areas of expertise or skill sets or talents that we didn't know that we had. What do you think? What's been one of those things that's developed for you through the course of being a business owner slash brewer?
Or it can show you things that you don't have and things that you need, or perhaps
Well, yeah, 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 yeah.
perhaps like, oh man, I really do need to go see a therapist. It can be revealing in all sorts of ways. But I think for me, one of the things that it's done is as an engineer and with an engineering brain, I naturally see failures or potential failures in things, and I want to solve them fairly
Mhm.
quickly. But I didn't know how much I would be driven when a crisis was in front of me, especially a mechanical crisis.
Yeah.
How much I would just like engage in overdrive and simultaneously be like, why is this machine, why is this glycol chiller down? But also enjoy kind of the thrill of fixing it and saying,
Yeah.
this is necessarily going to be fixed today.
Yeah.
We are not going to be stopped by this mechanical issue. So in the face of crises, being determined to get through the day and not be slowed down.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that was something I didn't know that I didn't know that I would have to do, or it was an engagement mode that I hadn't quite experienced in my career working for somebody else that was 9 to 5, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, how much is your of your brewery is there any automation in your brewery right now?
Not a ton. The brew house is fully manual. For the
How big of
most
a brew
part,
house is it?
it's effectively 20 hectoliter. I
Yeah.
mean, it's a little bit of a Frankenstein JV Premier system. So
Okay.
it's originally a JV 15 barrel brew house.
Yep.
But we had Premier 20 barrel Whirlpool added to it.
Mm.
So it depends on what we're brewing, but we really do work into all the headspace that it has. So typically our batch sizes, our turns, if you will, are 18 and a half to 19 barrels, which is really kind of like 20 hectoliters. But if you tell somebody you have an 18 barrel system, they're like, what? That doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But those are a typical batch sizes are 20 hectoliters.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the things that was different for me and when you were talking about, problem solving things. So I'm not like the engineering side of things does not come natively to me, but what I have found is in my years in the industry is I figured out ways to work around problems and make things work. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So like my creativity in that range has expanded, but it's been fascinating and frustrating to me that the brew house that I work on right now is is it a QTS? It's QTS. It's essentially a 30 barrel system. It is all automated. And I feel like every time something goes wrong, rather than thinking back like with my manual brain, the first thing I assume is that there's something that I'm not understanding about the automation side of it. And my brain is getting stuck there rather than dropping down into the troubleshooting saying, oh, there's still valves here. They're opened by air and different things like that. Right. But that's just a reps thing though, and I have 13 years of working on manual systems. You know what I mean? So to have everything be on a screen and I'm very tactile, like there's a lot of adjustment there. There's a lot of adjustment there. But all right. When you talk to people about what we do, what's one of the things that is some of the things people don't realize about what we do as brewers?
I just tell people I get loaded every day.
That's all it takes. That's all it takes.
What that mean, like what I think I do, what my parents think I do, what the public thinks I do. Man, that's I have different answers for that depending on which perspective it's coming from or which hat I'm wearing. Am I answering that as an owner, as a brewer,
Sure.
as kind of an employee?
Sure.
But I think a lot of people are unfamiliar with how much work goes into making beer at most small breweries, like how labor intensive it is. And I think they might be unaware of how much work it requires upfront before that beer ends up in a can or in a keg. So I think that might be one misconception, and how much cleaning and sanitation takes place in order to make clean beer.
Do you guys have a CIP skid and things like that?
We don't have a skid, but we've got plenty of SOPs.
Heck yeah, man! Heck yeah!
Not the same thing. No, so
Yeah.
we don't have a CIP skid.
Sure. How big of talking about SOPs up front, was that something that you invested a lot of time and energy into at the beginning of the brewery?
No, and I didn't need to when we first started out, because really it was just me, and
That's
then
right.
it was an
Yeah.
assistant, and
Yeah.
then a couple years in there was another assistant. So for a while it was just the three of us on the 10-barrel system at our brew pub in downtown Long Beach. And once we opened our production facility, then it became absolutely necessary, because then we had two facilities where we were sometimes making the same beers across facilities. So to create standardization, we had to do it then. Also, I wasn't burned out on engineering, but the last thing I wanted to do after leaving the field of engineering was write more SOPs. I had more than a decade of doing that. But anyway, we have a huge library of SOPs right now. Yeah. And so that was really, we kind of dove into that and did the bulk of that. I want to say about 7-8 years ago, when we first opened our production facility, to create uniformity across procedures, cross-training brewers. And so when they go to the pub versus at production facility, they're not cleaning tanks differently. They're doing it the same. And then also, as you grow and people might move on from Beachwood and you're bringing new people in, it's important. It makes it easier to train people, and it makes it easier for them to retain that training when they have an SOP to reference. Definitely. And then it also holds people accountable. How do you clean the tank? Well, here's the list of steps that I have to go through. So now we're pretty heavy into SOPs.
Yeah. When you're writing an SOP, so sometimes I feel like, well, what is the line between an SOP and a training document? Do you look at them as kind of one and the same, or do you have separate things for that? Or if I've been working in the industry, should I be able to walk into your house, grab the SOP, and know how to perform various tasks in the brewery?
It depends on the SOP, but if it's a brew house SOP, it does assume a certain level of requisite knowledge stepping into things. Yep. I don't think I don't think any brewery would expect somebody to pick up an SOP for a brew house and learn how to do everything without some industry experience.
Absolutely.
Cellar breaks it down a little bit more and gets a little bit more fundamental. So it depends on the SOP. But I think it's both a training tool and a reference tool.
Sure.
So if you came in and read one of our SOPs for sanitizing a fermenter, you would look through it and you would probably say, okay, I understand these steps. Like, all of this makes sense to me, even if the order of operations is a little bit different, even if the chemicals are a little bit different from what I'm used to at my previous facility. I get this. I can understand this.
Sure. Kind of speaking of hires and adding people to a brewery, having a growing brewery, do you prefer to hire experienced brewers? Do you or do you prefer to have people kind of work their way up through and get all their training through you? What's kind of your take on that?
We've always had the best performance from employees that started at the ground level, that started in the canning room or in the cellar, and we were able to get them fluency at every level of the brewery. So if you're going to kind of talk about the three main levels being packaging, cellar, and then brew house. So starting people at the ground level and matriculating them up, it creates fluency across all those three main platforms. And our most successful brewers, our most efficient brewers have always started that way. In fact, all the people who eventually became my brewery managers now, they all started at the ground level. And they're all able to multitask, and they're all able to jump in and help any of my staff at any point in the process.
Yeah.
And not just help, but guide them too.
Yeah. Yeah.
So given my druthers, I always like to start people at the ground level. In fact, I know there are some larger production facilities out there that even if you come in with 20 years of experience, they still start you at the ground level, even if they have like a prescribed matriculation, like, okay, you're a super experienced brewer, but you're going to spend a month on the canning line, a month in the cellar before you hop up to the brew house.
Yeah. Yeah. What's your thought with hires and education? You know, brewing is one of those. It's still one of those fields, I think, where we have a lot of people that apprentice in, and there's a lot of programs. There's obviously, you know, there's program at Davis, there's Siebel, there's some other things like that. And then increasingly, I think over the last 5 to 7 years in particular, we've seen a lot of different schools adding some measure of brewing science.
Sure.
What's your thought on that as far as hires? Do you have a preference? Would you rather just take somebody with interest, or is schooling a leg up in your mind?
Curiosity is always an incredibly valuable tool, not just in brewing, but I think in life. I also think diligence and paying attention to details. I think that people who tend to have very technical self-starting hobbies will do really well with brewing because it is a very technical profession. As far as formal brewing education goes, I think in the totality of Beachwood, we have hired 5 people that have had formal brewing education. One of them did a brewing training at Cal Poly, who's still with us. Another one did brewery training at the American Brewers Guild back east, and he was with us until very recently when he ended up going to work for the gentleman who bought my original brew pub in downtown Long Beach. And then we've had, we had a brewer from Davis, who's a really good brewer. We currently also have a brewer who went through the Siebel Domans Academy. And then we had another brewer a few years back who went through the Siebel Domans Academy, and they're both great. So it certainly helps. And I think it gives you an advantage. At the very least, it's exposure before you jump in.
Yeah, definitely. How many folks do you have on the production side of things?
Including my brewery manager, who's very much a very active working manager. At my production facility, it's 8 people, roughly 8 people.
Nice.
And we do also have Beachwood Blendery, which has a barrel master there and then his assistant. And then we have one employee currently that's like cross-trained on all of our systems and kind of bounces around a little bit.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. How many barrels a year are you shooting for in 2024?
2024, if we get these additional tanks in, probably somewhere around 12 or 13,000 company wide.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
That's awesome, man. That's awesome. And so, then distro, how far does distro go for you?
Primarily distro is in Southern California, but even more specific to that, I'd say 90% of our distributed beer is sold in coastal Los Angeles, Orange, and San Diego counties. So we keep it really close to home. We do go inland a little bit. We do go north of the greater LA area, just sprinklings in Northern California. And then maybe 3 to 4 times a year, we will send some beer to Las Vegas. We have an Arizona distributor, a Colorado distributor, an Oregon distributor, and then on rare occasion, we sprinkle stuff in Chicago and New York.
Yeah.
But 90% of our distributable beer is very close to home and very local.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Kind of, what's that can to keg split look like for you guys?
Pretty much 50-50.
Yeah. Yeah. And what do you, this is just some, I don't know what's popping off out there. Like, in our neck of the woods, we're starting to see more 19.2s and stuff like that. Do you guys dabble in 19.2s at all?
We don't. The market hasn't really asked for that from us, at least. I think if you're a mid-sized to large brewer, you definitely need to hit that format. I think if you're selling at places like large chains, like convenience stores where people want to grab a really big tall boy at the end of the day, if you're in convenience stores and if you're in chain grocery stores, the 19.2 format is pretty essential for those breweries. But one of the things that's unique about Beachwood, at least currently, is we are fully penetrated in independent liquor and grocery stores. We have almost no chain store placements. That's actually changing starting in Q2. We're finally launching into chain grocery stores, which we've never done before.
And is there, obviously there's a thought process to that. What led you to take that path?
Well, originally we didn't need to launch in the chain stores. We got all the beer that we could make was, even today, is still on allocation through our primary distributor. And it was always going to very kind of curated mom and pop liquor stores. But ultimately it was our distributor that came back to us with this 18 to 24 month roadmap. Hey, you guys, we see growth for you, and we want to get you into chain stores, and here's what we think it will do for your sales. And they had a very kind of quantitative path. And it wasn't just like produce X amount more and we're just going to blast it into that market.
Yeah.
It's produce X amount. We're going to stage you guys up over a period of 18 months and grow you into these chains. And we met with the chains, we met with the chain buyers, and we got buy-in. And so we're edging into that starting Q2. And even with this capacity that I'm adding to my production facility, I don't know if it's going to be enough.
Yeah.
So we might need to spin off some of our beers to contract brewing. But if that's the case, there's so many phenomenal breweries in my area that I would fully trust to pull off some of that beer.
Yeah.
We're almost there. We're not there yet.
Sure. Well, and you mentioned a point too, where, I mean, for me, and I don't know if it's because my home brewing roots in a lot of ways are very California centric. Because I came up listening to Brewing Network. It was California home brewers, it was California professional brewers that they're talking to, and those, I mean, through a wide range of stuff. And so, I came up listening to that stuff. And so there is all this great beer out there.
For sure. I think there might be something wrong with this beer. It's clear.
Yeah, right. That was gorgeous. So that was the question. What beer are you drinking, man?
I am drinking. This is our local, really only available in Long Beach beer, LBC IPA. And this is kind of, we first came up with this beer. It was over 10 years ago. It was draft only for a long time. But I came up with that beer mainly to prove that you could do a West Coast IPA with just somewhat old school ingredients.
Yeah. And
so that beer is super stripped down. It is American 2-row. That's the only malt that goes into it. It's hopped with 682 extract, which used to be called Pato. And then it gets Centennial at the Whirlpool. And then the dry hop is entirely our Beachwood Select CTZ /Columbus.
Yeah. Oh wow, nice.
It's
Nice, man.
incredibly dank. It's like somebody scraped out bong resin. It's just the right amount of garlic onion. But yeah, this is our new 2023 Select CTZ, and it's, oh man.
That's awesome, man. And one of the things that I think is different, I definitely do think that there is regional difference in palate. And I had known that I had wanted to talk West Coast
Yeah.
IPA with you. I kind of want to talk about like the arc of what that beer has been, what it is now. But you mentioned something right there, which to me is it's a big, it's a big bell. It's a big alert. I think especially since we're pushing further, harder and harder on tropical hops, different things like that. The first thing you said, the fact that the dry hop is purely CTZ, right? And I mean, a hop pretty notorious for its capacity to deliver some deep dank cannabis flavors and aromas. Um, is that something that is dank still like big on the West Coast? Because by me, where I am in the Midwest, I don't see a lot of beers pushing dank, right? Everything's tropical fruity.
There's things have definitely shifted if you're going to talk about the majority of West Coast IPAs that are brewed in, let's just say, California alone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, things have definitely trended more tropical overall, but I wouldn't want to overstate that. There are a lot of breweries out there that make a point to get some dankness in there because they don't want to stray too far. I think there's definitely been some cross-pollination from hazy IPA, that big, juicy, tropical flavor that a lot of people expect. Just in general from hazy IPA, I think that's absolutely had some influence on West Coast IPA. And so you see a lot more tropical flavors and aromas that are hop derived in West Coast IPAs now. But when I think about, a brewery like Russian River, still make sure there's some dankness in there. And I think about a brewery like a newer, more modern West Coast IPA brewery like Ghost Town, from my hometown in Oakland. They absolutely try and get a dank edge in a lot of the stuff that they do. I usually look for it.
What do you think is kind of that line? And maybe this is maybe the question isn't the exact right question, but I feel like when the line between dank and onion and garlic, I feel like there can be some overlap, whether that be real or perceived. In your mind, is that a true statement that there can be some overlap between potentially some of like those allium type flavors and aromas, and then leading more into the dank side of things?
For sure, you can go overboard with anything. And you can absolutely have a beer that's a little bit too alliacious and that is just all
Alliacious.
alliacious.
I like that. I was
$5 word there. Boom. You said allium.
I thought I was doing something with allium, but you went with alliacious. That's fantastic, man.
Anyway,
but yeah.
I like a little bit of that. I like some of that for sure in my CTZ. But if we're going to talk specifically about CTZ, it's already a later harvest hop. And so anything that's later harvest typically tends to pick up those characteristics. But I wouldn't want like the latest harvest CTZ. And so the stuff that we tend to pick is kind of in the middle of the CTZ window. So kind of like the latter third of September usually. And it's not the highest alpha stuff. So, generally how that works is hops become ripe, and then overly ripe as the alphas tend to rise, but so does that alliacious character. So our CTZ this year is clocking in right around 15% alpha acid, which is on kind of actually the medium low end for CTZ. We see that as it starts trending north of 17 alphas, that it really becomes overwhelmingly garlic and onion.
So in a beer like that, where you're dry hopping with it, can you give me like a ballpark of what we'd be looking at for a dry hop with something like that as far as volume?
This beer specifically is 2 pounds per barrel, so it's modest. It's not really that high. However, our CTZ is incredibly impactful and very
Yeah.
oily.
Mm-hmm.
I think our CTZ this year came in at like 2.7 or 2.8
Yeah.
percent oil. So
Yeah.
it's really oily. It's always been that way. It's always been super impactful. And I think if I am looking to get that same level of impact from some other more notable varieties, like maybe Citra, I would have to probably go closer to 3 pounds per barrel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So a lot of that's varietal specific.
You know, and I've heard you mention that before, and we're gonna talk. I have a question from a brewer friend of mine, talking about selection. But you had mentioned dry hop. Is dry hop something? Are you rousing your dry hop? Are you circulating? As far as like with a hop like CTZ, do you feel like there's a point for contact time to where you're going to be going too far with that? What are some of your thoughts on that?
We have to move things through the production environment quick enough that I've never seen any issues with too much contact. At least in our West Coast IPAs. I was recently discussing with my brewery manager about some dry hopped lagers that maybe, like we want to get the hops off of those beers and not, dry hop them and let them sit on the dry hops and lager at the same time. But in general, we're not seeing any over extraction on this stuff.
Sure.
And we do rouse, to answer your question. Yeah, we rouse every beer usually 24 to 48 hours after the initial dry hop. And we do that with CO2. We just blast it through the bottom port. That's kind of the method that I learned from Matt Cole at Fatheads. We don't recirc. We've done that before. We've tried it, and I didn't, at least on our system, the way that things work out, I didn't find that impact was any more meaningful than
the rouse.
Good CO2 blast. But the other thing too is it's definitely riskier and a lot more time consuming.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, I can see that. Oh, there was something as we were talking. I had something go off in my brain when we were talking about that. You had mentioned that there's typically not a because of the production environment. You're typically turning and burning those tanks and whatnot. So are you? I wanted to ask dry hop temp. It just kind of general rule of thumb around the brewery, or if you have different temps for different things.
We don't generally have different temps for different things, unless it's a dry hop lager. But in general, 60 degrees for our IPAs, and pretty much anything that's getting dry hopped. And even lagers that get dry hopped, we try and get all the yeast out of there, and we'll dry hop them, and then we'll turn off the jackets and let things free rise during that re-fermentation that happens in every single beer that you dry hop, except maybe a brut IPA. But in general, 60 degrees is where we hold things, and it depends on the beer, but in general, we're at 60 degrees for 5 to 6 days, and then we step cool down to 45 on usually like the 6th day after the dry hop has been introduced, and then the 7th day afterwards, we'll usually drop down to 32 degrees. And with each one of those drops, we'll dump the slurry.
Yeah. What do you find the benefits of that measured stepped drop for those beers, temperature wise?
I was always a little scared of shocking the yeast, but more than that, it's much easier in our glycol system. As opposed to just ramming something down, 30 degrees overnight. You can get away with so much less cooling. I think if we dropped our beers from 60 to 32 routinely and overnight, we'd need more chillers than we have now, and bigger chillers.
That's interesting. Yeah, because that's one of those crashing tanks, cooling side to side, which you mentioned and is interesting. But I feel like that's one of those areas, because especially when you talk to, I've talked to yeast lab lab folks who are like, listen, you can just, once the beer passes VDK, you can, it's clean, your terminal, you can just crash it. And it's actually better to do that, to get the yeast to a point where you can get, the yeast in the cone out of the beer. But then again, you'll talk to other people specifically, and I know, a lot of folks on the German side of things will talk about that stepped cooling. And I've always wondered about, like hard research on that, right? As far as that goes, because I have heard, that it's easier on the yeast, X, Y, and Z. But yeah, I've always wondered, I've always wanted to dig deeper into that.
Well, I think the answer is it depends on so many factors, and a lot of that can be just entirely dependent on the yeast strain, independent of the beer style, independent of your brew system. A lot of that can be dependent purely on the yeast strain. There may be some strains that react totally well, and you crash them hard, and they don't release anything. They just go to sleep and drop out of suspension. There may be other yeast strains out there that struggle with that and don't react as well and need a little bit of an adjustment point, or adjustment period, if you will.
Sure. And so we mentioned a couple of things. We talked about West Coast IPA, and then also lager. Do you have a couple of do you have a go-to strain for, just in general, like favorite lager strain, favorite ale strain for West Coast IPA?
For West Coast IPA, specifically White Labs Cal Ale has always been our workhorse, and we've tried other, what people would call equivalent strains, like we'll just say YE's 1056, the Fermentus US05. We've tried BSI's Cal Ale before, and they're similar, but they're not the same.
What do you find? What do you get out of the specific strain from White Labs that you don't feel like you get out of the other ones?
I think White Labs ferments the driest. I think one of the other labs that I mentioned, I won't say specifically, I think has a tendency to throw an acid aldehyde component, or a trace acid aldehyde component that I find problematic. So the White Labs is very accessible. They're very close to us, but moreover, that yeast performs incredibly well for us. It's very clean. It's very neutral. When the yeast is really hitting its stride, that's the one that resembles the Sierra Nevada flavor profile closest to me.
Okay. Where are you? Are you buying full pitchable quantities? Do you have a yeast? I'm thinking brink.
A prop tank.
Yeah, a prop tank. Yeah. Do you have a prop tank?
I wish. Beachwood has always been a bootstrap brewery, so if there is something that's kind of nice to have, sometimes we gotta work towards it. But no, we don't. We typically prop up our Cal Ale in a single batch of IPA, or we'll prop it up in some kind of lighter style. But that will ultimately go for 6 to 9 generations and get used, like dozens upon dozens of times before we retire that particular pitch.
So yeah, that was my next question: is how many turns are you getting out of that single purchase?
In the aggregate, I would probably say we're getting between 40 and 50 uses out of a single pitch, really. So at that point, what difference does it really make whether I'm propping it up in a single batch or a triple batch? But we're definitely able to spread out that cost quite a bit with Cal Ale.
Well, and that's fantastic too, because when you can get that much out of your yeast, you don't need to be worrying about a brink or a prop or anything like that. You did mention being kind of a bootstrapped operation. I would say being able to use a strain that many times definitely implies that you have top shelf SOP as far as cleaning and sanitation. And so what do you have going on lab wise?
Lab wise, we're fairly basic, but we do cell counts and viability checks on everything.
Mm-hmm.
And then we do make sure to pay attention to vitality, which there
Mm-hmm.
is a lab test that you can do for that. Not anything that most people can readily do, but you can observe it, and
Sure.
you can certainly see that in general, if you're dropping a certain amount of points per day, you can kind of grade the vitality of the yeast that way.
Yeah. Um, what was the other one that I want to go on that, because I was really interested. Are you harvesting? Are you harvesting and repitching by weight, or are you going back and doing cell count on your harvests and then pitching from there?
We're doing it volumetrically.
Hmm.
So whether you do it by weight or volume, as
Sure.
long as you can correlate that to a general overall cell count. So Cal is very easy to work with. It's very predictable, and we've done it enough times that we're usually able to say, okay, we're going to harvest off this beer. We need X amount of liters that will get us X amount of cells, and then we'll do the count. We'll be like, yep, we hit it.
Yep.
Our lager strain is a little bit more finicky,
Mm.
and we're currently on the Modelo strain,
Okay.
which is beautiful. It's a beautiful strain. It doesn't tend to flocculate quite as much as Cal Ale. The harvests are a little bit more difficult,
Hmm.
and we've also found that the viability kind of tends to drop off fairly quickly. It's
Okay.
not like Cal. You could have a beer that was fully crashed down to 32 degrees, and you could have yeast that was sitting in the cone of that fermenter for a week plus, and
Hmm.
you would probably see above 80% viability if you
Damn.
wanted to harvest.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Modelo lager strain does not do that. We're kind of finding that, at least the way that we handle it in the brewery, it likes to be repitched every 6 to 12 days at the
Okay.
latest. And then the viability really just like, boom,
Yeah. Yeah.
drops way off. So that can be kind of challenging at times.
Yeah. As far as yeast health goes, are you adding any hot side yeast nutrient?
No, we're not using any hot side yeast nutrient, except when we use beer, when we brew beers that don't have a lot of free amino nitrogen, like maybe a Weizen beer or some kind of pastry stout, something that's very adjunct heavy. But I would preface that by saying we are absolutely doing cold side nutrient.
Okay.
So a few months ago, we switched. We were having some issues with our lager strain, and it was really just kind of fighting us.
Hmm.
And I decided to do a deep dive into zinc and really kind of quantifying the zinc levels that
Yeah.
we had in our beer, and it was just not where we thought it was. We were dosing zinc in the kind of right before Whirlpool, and it
Hmm.
was getting bound up in the troop,
Yeah.
and it was creating just unpredictable amounts of zinc in the wort. And our Cal Ale was not as sensitive to that as our lager strain, but our
Mhm.
lager strain was very sensitive to that. So now we do a couple things. So with most of our ales, we're now pitching a sanitary zinc solution on the cold side directly into the fermenter.
Mhm.
And then I guess I should back up a little bit and say, on the hot side, if we are brewing a high gravity lager and then we have one turn where we're doing a water back to bring it
Yep.
down to the composite low gravity, we will pitch the yeast nutrient into that water back because it's not going to
Okay.
get bound up in the troop.
Yes, that makes
And
sense.
so we're effectively doing, I'll call it cold side yeast nutrient for our zinc. And across the board, we started seeing like 1 to 2 days sooner terminal. We were
Ah.
seeing about 3 to 5% higher viability
Mhm.
in our harvests. And we were seeing denser cell counts across the board. We're seeing better
Mhm.
flocculation, typically better clarity in the finished beer. It was just fighting us a lot less. But we found that our lager yeast in particular, that the ester profile was much more vibrant and expressive in the way that we wanted when
Mhm.
we were dosing on the cold side. And
Mhm.
I have read some technical papers that talk about lagers requiring half the amount of zinc that ales do. I don't know where that comes from, and in my experience, that's counter to what is true.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
But even in our Cal Ale beers, our West Coast IPAs are all malt. And in most of our West Coast IPAs, we're seeing around 95% apparent attenuation.
Mm, mm.
Like really dry.
Yeah, yeah. So that's all fascinating. So do you have any like any target ranges that you're looking for getting zinc into those beers? And does that fluctuate based on the density of the beer of the work going into the fermenter?
In general, no, it doesn't. As long as you hit if we're doing a high gravity beer, yes, we will proportion things a little bit higher, especially in like a double IPA or a pastry stout. Not that much though. It doesn't require that much, but in general, we're shooting for 0.3 ppm or 300 parts per billion of zinc. We are working on the assumption that we're getting about 100 parts per billion from the malt, especially in an all malt beer. And then our current dosing rate allows for 200 parts per billion for a composite of 300 parts per billion in our wort. And then that gets gobbled up immediately by the yeast within a matter of hours. The zinc level.
That's my understanding. Yeah.
They go from 300 to 0 in a matter of hours.
And is there an upper there's an upper limit to which I've heard there's an upper limit to where you can go too far with your zinc addition, basically.
You certainly can. People talk about zinc toxicity, but I think that's north of 2 parts per million.
Okay.
If you talk to some yeast labs that are willing to reveal a little bit of what they do on the front end for production, I think I've talked to a couple of yeast labs who go as high as 2 parts per million for their propagations. So if that's favorable for growing up yeast, I mean, those are places that have very extensive labs. I would hope that that's the correct answer.
Yeah. And how are you getting that? How are you getting that into your fermenter on the cold side?
Usually it depends on the size of the fermenter. Sometimes we're putting a little elbow and a butterfly valve on a side port. And once we start getting some wort in there, we will open up that butterfly valve and we'll just pour it down that elbow, that 90-degree elbow that's on the side port. But other times we're getting on top of the fermenter and it's going in through the dry hop port or through the PRV port. It really depends. We've got multiple ports on our fermenters. But one thing I started doing was batching this stuff in an autoclave. So I bought one of the big instant pots. And then I got a whole bunch of autoclavable bottles off of Amazon and pre-mixing the solution, the zinc solution, and putting in a prescribed amount in those bottles and then autoclaving them, and then you can stick them in the fridge and you guys can just grab and go.
Dude, that's the shit. Okay, you got me really excited. So I'm very because literally I was gonna say, because you said you're creating a sterile zinc solution. Yeah. So that's immediately where I was going was, all right, so tell me about this process, because we do have an autoclave. And interesting. Because I think sometimes those are some things that people can either overlook, or it can be something to where they're unsure of the sanitary side of it, so they don't end up playing with it. You know what I mean? Like, it's just a fear of doing something wrong, and so you're not going in that direction at all. But that's interesting, because I was so glad you said that. I had a friend of mine who said that they were taking samples of their wort and having it evaluated, and that's exactly what they were finding, was the nutrient that they're throwing into the kettle was in the trub, that it wasn't in the wort. And that's interesting. So you're talking about on tank fill, that's going in there.
Yep. It's going in tank fill. And a couple months ago, I had some really, really good conversations with my friends at Sierra Nevada and Russian River Brewing about zinc dosing. And those two breweries they approach it very, very differently from one another. But Sierra Nevada has a remarkably extensive lab, and Russian River doesn't have anything to sneeze at either. They've got a very extensive lab, but Sierra Nevada had ultimately felt comfortable correlating an increased dose on the hot side, knowing that a certain amount was getting bound up in the trub.
Okay.
Russian River doesn't work that way. They're like, no, we're most comfortable dosing on the cold side, where we're very certain of what's going in there.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of weighed those two against each other, and also factored in some conversations that I have with people at White Labs, and then came to the decision that at our scale, it's very easy for us to add it on the cold side and autoclave things. We're not doing 24 turns in a day on multiple brew houses. So it's very easy for us to manage it in that very precise way. So let's do it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super interesting. That's super interesting. And this has my mind going just on that topic of dosing elements into the fermenter on cold side, right? I have been, one of the things I found out over the last year is apparently I've developed a relatively legitimate sensitivity to gluten.
Okay.
And it's a serious bummer, man. I'm not gonna lie. And so like for me, it's one of those things where the last time I had 2 normal beers, and it was just like this over and over, but I would retain a ton of water and get super depressed and super anxious for like 4 days, and then I would eat gluten-free again. Well, because I was trying to eat gluten-free anyways, but then I'll drop all that water in one day. I'm like 3-4 days afterwards, and I'm completely fine. And it sucks, but it has led me to playing around with Brewers Clarex.
We use that.
And so this is one of the things I was going to ask. So cold side enzyme addition to the fermenter. So how many beers do you use it on?
We use it pretty much just in our lagers, because we've found that if we eliminate any of those haze causing proteins, it's that much less we need to combat when it comes to clarifying the beer. Mm-hmm. So we don't do any filtration. When I bought my production facility in 2016, we inherited a brand new plate and frame. And at the beginning of, we weren't a lager brewery.
Yeah.
And then at the beginning of COVID, I sold that plate and frame, and I really regret it because we became somewhat of a lager brewery. That's now like 10% of our production. But we still do everything we still do all of our clarification through finings. And we find that our lager strain, the cells are much smaller than ale yeast. And so the way that those get enmeshed with finings requires a higher dose. But if you're only really having to contend with the yeast and a lot less with haze causing proteins, it's easier to clarify the beer. So with our lagers, we do use Clarex. And so if you have any one of our lagers, I guess they would be gluten reduced.
Yeah, and I tell you, so the effects of this are so bad that I almost have an aversion to it, and it's taken me like a while to get over. I have a buddy that uses Clarex on everything that's non-hazy, right? Mm-hmm. And he uses it at the rate that will, is for gluten reduction and whatnot. And I can drink those beers and have no problem. So that's really nice. And I'm actually about to brew a beer for the first one. So I've been at a new brewery. I've been at a brewery called Sonder Brewing since August of last year. And I'm going to be using Clarex for the first time. And I'm doing a little half batch, a little 15 barrel batch of Munich Dunkel. Dunkel's one of my favorite styles,
for sure.
And so we're going to be using Clarex on that, and then we're going to be piloting it on. We have a distributed brand called Voss, which is a Kolsch. And so we're gonna try it out in Kolsch as well, and because part of my sell is we do filter, and it's supposed to, they sell it as being able to extend filter life,
Right.
And I've got some buddies that use the centrifuge as well, and they say their beers coming out of the fermenter are brighter on their way to the centrifuge and everything like that. So that's been your experience with it as well?
It's been my experience with it as well, but as you mentioned, anybody I know who runs a much larger production facility who does filtration and centrifugation has said that when they use Clarex, the beer is much easier to clarify in the end.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it it's not an expensive enzyme.
True.
The dosing rate isn't that high. It goes in with the yeast. There is a I believe Alpine Brewing, which is now McElhenney, which was, I should say not Alpine Brewing is not now McElhenney Brewing really in that sense, but I believe Alpine Brewing for a long time used Clarex in all of their beers across the board to no negative effect. I mean, killer West Coast IPA. I don't know if Sean McElhenney is still brewing those beers that way at his eponymous brewery, but I think you can use it really to no negative effect. I don't know if I've ever had a beer brewed with it where it's like, oh my God, this is lacking, or this killed some characteristic in the beer.
I agree. And we were turning, when I was at the brewery before this, we were turning lighter German lagers with regularity, that and a rice lager. And when I started using Clarex, well, first of all, I started using Clarex because I didn't have a filter. And if I was going to be entering lagers into competitions, I wanted those things to be as bright as possible, and so that was what got me playing with it. And yeah, I mean, I dropped some really clear lagers with nothing other than that and some biofine, you know what I mean? Not having the filter. But and just a note on this, just so everyone knows, I'm not saying, and we're not saying that this makes a gluten-free beer or anything like that. I think legally, as long as any ingredient that is intrinsic to the raw ingredient, if it has gluten, something can't be gluten-free. But it does seem to be, is it 20 parts per million? Is that the line? Or is it
I thought it was 10, but
it might be 10.
It might be 10, but I will say that I just think from a safety standpoint, I've never made any kind
100%
about any of the beers that we do.
Yeah.
So if somebody asks me, is this gluten reduced or is this gluten free? I can mention what we use in the beer, but I'm not going to make any hard claims.
I feel really comfortable with that as well, because it is one of those things like, and I don't know, we'll see. Like over the last year, I have, I've drank less and less. It hasn't necessarily hurt me to drink less and less either, but yeah, I mean, it will be nice to be able to have a beer with the guys after work, because right now I can't, because everything we make in house is, so that is a nice thing. So I am excited about it, and I'm glad to hear, anecdotally out in the field, a lot of folks that that are doing that stuff are running it as well.
I got to say this though, I've had the honor of judging World Beer Cup and GABF for many years now, and anytime you judge, you fill out a questionnaire like, what categories do you want to judge, what do you not want to judge, are there any that you can't judge because of conflict of interest, or you have like an allergy to certain ingredients, they're always in a certain style. But for World Beer Cup last year, I got pegged with judging first, second, and medal round of gluten-free beer.
Okay.
And I was like, you got to be kidding me. Really? Okay. I'm honored to be here, but this one's going to be a struggle. And you know what? Wow. It was awesome. I always want to judge gluten-free beer, because gluten-free beer and the things that go into gluten-free beer have evolved so much from where they were 10 years ago. And the 3 beers that we picked as medal winning beers in World Beer Cup last year were stellar. not even relative to the fact that they were gluten-free.
Really?
There was no relativity in the final judgment. Like, these are amazing beers. And one of the keys or one of the commonalities with the medal winning beers in the beers that kind of tended to rise to the top in that category was malted millet.
Okay.
And I still don't know quite where you get it and how you brew with it. I need to talk to these breweries. But the beer that won gold was it was a bourbon barrel aged millet wine.
Really?
And you had this thing and you would have thought it was Bourbon County Stout.
Wow.
I was like, this has mouthfeel, this has flavor, this doesn't taste weird.
Yeah.
It tastes like a bitchin' bourbon barrel aged
Yeah, man.
like dark ale. Like, this is awesome. But anyway, gluten-free beer with gluten-free ingredients, light years ahead of where it used to be.
Damn, and I've got to climb back in. You know, the nice thing is that on staff, there's 6 other folks in the brewery that help with sensory and everything like that. So there's a lot of palates to go around, and so, you know, me not being able to get my palate on something doesn't hurt in the same way. But yeah, I mean, you know, it's not so much selfishly, but I really do hope that we do see the benefit in using that product, because that's one thing. It's been an impediment for me, you know, like, and Sonder's great with it, and Cartridge, the brewery I was with before, was great with it. They would let me use Clerics or whatever, but it's a problem, you know what I mean, for a professional in this industry, right? So,
well, I don't shy away from enzymes. If they make better beer, then I'm happy to use them. And the couple beers that we use multiple enzymes, not just one.
Yep. So, and I'm thinking maybe you're talking ALDC, but let me ask you a question here real quick before I go too far. So there's in my mind, because I was thinking about it. I was thinking about it today. My addition of Clerics into the fermenter. The vessel that I measure that in, typically what I've done is I try to make sure I have a clean vessel, and then I would hit it with some sort of, no rinse liquid sanitizer of some sort, and then try to let that dry, and then measure into that. Because in my mind is if I have alcohol in that measuring vessel, can that denature that enzyme?
So. I mean,
Well, no, that's right. I'm thinking I was thinking more on a micro level. Yeah, that's 2 different things.
In general, when it comes to enzymes, the 2 things that kind of denature enzymes, the first one is temperature. Is your biggest enemy when it comes to denaturing an enzyme is high temperature. Cold temperatures can kind of protract the activity of an enzyme, but they're typically still acting even at low temperatures. And then pH can start to inhibit the effectivity of an enzyme, depending on the particular enzyme. Like you just mentioned, ALDC. I mean, ALDC is really effective at pHs above 6, but who's dry hopping a beer at a pH that high? So, but when it comes to our Clerics, we have acrylic food grade measuring cups that we sanitize in a parasitic solution. We measure it out. It goes in. Clerics goes in our yeast brink with our yeast, but we just dump it right in. I don't worry about the measuring container drying or anything. That gets fully cleaned, and then it's in a parasitic acid bath.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Let's shift gears a little bit. I did want to talk to you about kind of in my notes, I wrote down kind of the career arc of West Coast IPA. I remember growing up, coming into the beer scene. I was born and raised in Michigan, and I'm raised with Two Hearted, and I'm raised with Centennial IPA from Founders. I'm raised with a lot of, definitely past golden, sometimes into that like orangish type IPA. So in my mind, like when I think about, I came up on Midwest IPA, right?
Right.
Midwest IPA to me is it's got some Munich malt in it. It's got maybe some, well, at that point, yeah, there's probably some crystal malt in there. And in order to ultimately balance that beer, you have to make that beer more bitter to get over top of that residual sweetness that's being driven by the crystal malt. Okay. So anyways, they're definitely sweeter, darker beer. So that's what I came up on. And then I was listening to Brewing Network when I was coming up, and there was all these guys talking about like these really pale IPAs, right? And so when I first went pro, I'm like, well, that's the IPA I'm gonna make. I'm gonna make a really pale beer. And I mean, this was back in the day, so this might sound silly to you, but this was probably 2012. And I'm like, listen, what I'm doing with my IPA is I'm getting, a handful of Magnum at 60, in a 15 barrel system, something just to break the kettle, turn it over. And then I had like a small, like maybe a 10-minute, but I think at first I was just going all Whirlpool, right? And just having a really big Whirlpool edition, but really pushing all those additions really, really late. And I had a brewer friend of mine come in and be like, and say, man, this IPA is really pale, right? And he goes, well, this is kind of fun and kind of cool. And it's just me mimicking, what just some things that I had heard about. We're going out there. Hell yeah, man.
That's 2-row. This beer is probably tests around 3.5 SRM.
Yeah. I think there's something beautiful about that, right? Because there's almost there's I love when the visual of the beer sometimes doesn't imply what the beer is, right? So sometimes when people see beers that light, they think, oh, I'm getting a light lager, I'm getting something like this. Sometimes color intensity can imply subtlety in intensity and flavor. And that's one of the things that I love. And especially in today's day with hazy IPA, I just love that complete opposite. The pale, very clear, bright, crisp beer. What do you think, like in your mind, thinking back, what was West Coast IPA, and then how has that grown or evolved over the years?
So I can give some history on that. I moved to Southern California in 2003. It's hard to believe I've been here for 21 years now. Time flies. But when I moved to Southern California, one of the first places I visited was Pizza Port in San Clemente. They had just opened that location. This is at the end of 2004, I believe. And then I also did pop down to the Pizza Ports in Carlsbad, Solana Beach. Those are the locations that they had back then, 20 years ago at this point. And this is right before Jeff Bagby was brewing at Pizza Port Carlsbad. His predecessor named Kirk McHale was still brewing there. But when I think back 20 years to the beers that I had almost specifically at Pizza Port that blew my mind, they were really pale in color. They were bracingly hoppy. They were uniquely aromatic. And they were really, really dry. And one of the beers, kind of apropos to your comment about, oh, it's so pale. One of the beers that kind of disabused me of that idea that IPA needs to be balanced by crystal malt, needs to be balanced by Munich malt. I think that's historically that may have been true. It was also something that was kind of in the echo chamber of the homebrew world.
Yeah.
And to a degree it still is.
Yeah.
But I had a beer at Pizza Port in Solana Beach. This might have been in 2005. And I saw it on the menu. It was called Lou P. Lin. Obviously a play on lupulin. And I was like, I don't know what that is. There was no description. I don't know what that is, but I know that's going to be hoppy. I'm going to get that. Give me that beer.
Yeah.
And I get back to my table with a pint of this beer. It's super pale. And I was holding it several feet away from my face. And it was just bowled over by this aroma. It had a
Yeah.
huge aroma, and it was an amazingly dry, delicious, crazy aromatic beer. And then a few weeks later, I saw Tommy Arthur at an event at Stone Brewing, and this is when Tommy was still brewing all the beers at Pizza Port Solana Beach, on that little 7-barrel system. And I asked him what was in Lou P. Lynn. He said, "Oh, it's just like 2 row and some dextrose. It was a double IPA." Like, yeah, what crystal malt did you use in that beer? Like, I didn't use crystal malt in that beer. And that blew my mind. Holy shit, that beer was amazing. You didn't use it. And so it made me realize that I needed to kind of tear up the blueprint for my own IPAs. And I really think it was San Diego brewers specifically that came up with that idea, that you can use just base malt. You can have these crazy pale, dry, hoppy beers where the hops shine front and center. And I think West Coast IPA is very unique in some ways. And this is also what drives its popularity. True West Coast IPA. It is the only beer that is that aromatic, that flavorful, and that drinkable. It has a unique intensity and drinkability that I don't think you get almost from any other style. And so that's why I think it's done really well. And I love Two Hearted Ale. I love Founders Centennial IPA. Those are fantastic beers. And I think they exist in a slightly different space than West Coast IPA, especially as influenced by San Diego. And so San Diego has given the most influence to my IPAs over the years. And how has that style transitioned over the years? People have trended towards paler and paler malts. There are a lot of smaller breweries that I think are using pale Pilsner malts or just extra pale malts to get their base. Some of them are even using dextrose in regular 6.5 to 7.5% IPAs, and they're trending towards slightly softer bitterness and even more flavor and aroma, and incorporating some of those newer tropical hops, but not so much so that the hop profile would be confused with something out of a hazy IPA.
Certainly. So the thing that's fascinating to me, because I've been workshopping some cold IPA concepts, right? And by saying that, I'm doing research, I'm listening to other people, and I always think there's this interesting line with. Well, one of the things that I hear frequently when I talk to brewers, California-based brewers, is talking about dry beer. In your mind, with West Coast IPA, and I feel like with so many things that we're doing, whether you look at beer as beer or beer through a culinary lens, ultimately we're trying to achieve certain levels of balance, right? Like that's a big key. Now it can be, I think, you could say, well, IPA itself is inherently unbalanced, but you understand what I'm saying, right?
I do.
When it comes to a crisp, dry West Coast IPA, there's going to be obviously multiple factors that go into creating that harmonious drinking experience, right? Because if you take your water profile too far in one direction or another, obviously it's going to impact that finished beer. The IBU that you're putting into that beer, and in my mind, even the location of those IBU in the boil. All right, because and this was something that I wanted to bounce off you. To me, 30 IBUs that are derived from a bittering addition that is boiled for 60 minutes is different than 30 IBUs that come from a whirlpool addition. Just and in my mind, just from a sensory standpoint, my calculator might tell me my calculator might tell me that, but I know in my mind I adjust it to say, well, okay, even though the whirlpool is telling me I'm getting 30 IBU here, it's going to taste like 15. That's just what I do. That's what I do in my mind as I'm structuring things out. That's kind of one thing nested in there, but also just what do you think those key components are to, because there's delicate lines in West Coast IPA. What do you think are some of those bullet point things that help keep that beer in a refreshing range?
Well, dryness first and foremost. I'll say that most Beachwood core IPAs finish around 1.4 to 1.5 Plato. They're pretty dry.
It's dry as hell, man. Yeah.
Sometimes they finish at 1.2 Plato.
Mm-hmm.
They're pretty dry. So I would say the beer has to be dry. I think you should use no specialty malt in the beer. You can use base malt or multiple base malts. And then the way that the bitterness presents too, it should be really hoppy. It should be moderately hoppy to, I guess, could call it moderately high hopping. It shouldn't be just so, these days, I don't think it should be just so hoppy that all you taste is bitterness. But I think that you talked about IBUs. I think there's definitely a difference between BUs and IBUs.
Okay.
And if you were to look at the lab analysis on one of our hazy IPAs, it might have comparable BUs to one of our West Coast IPAs, but the bitterness does not present the same. And you can actually drive bitterness too through your, like you were talking about earlier, your mineral content. But I think West Coast IPAs should have a lingering bitterness that even after most of the flavor has left your palate, 10, 15 minutes later, you're still like, yeah, there's a little bit of it there, kind of on the back of my palate. So there should be this lasting, sustainable bitterness to the beer that also kind of sets the foundation for those successive sips. So the beer acclimates to your palate differently, but it hangs on there in a way that other styles might not.
And what is that range for you as far as bitterness? Because I know you have, and pardon me, I know you have 2 packaged year-round IPAs, correct?
As far as West Coast goes, we technically have 3, but the cores would be Amalgamator and Citraholic. Secondly to those 2 would be what I'm drinking right now, which is LBC IPA.
Which is actually my buddy Bill Gerds brews for Linwood Brewing Concern out on the East Coast, and he said, please ask him he said, please mention when you're talking to him the fact that you guys actually worked something out the way we should be in our industry.
We did. We have a trademark a federal trademark on LBC IPA, but Linwood Brewing Concern, the other LBC, also has a federal trademark, and we very amicably, easily came up with a coexistence agreement.
That's how you do it. I mean, that's a beautiful thing.
And then anybody else who tries to trespass, done.
That's right.
2 of us are good though.
Well, and then Billy also, so I texted him today. He absolutely, he just absolutely loves you, because he's another one of those guys. He came up the same time I did. He was a BN guy. And I know he's hit you up over the years about a handful of things. So he wanted me to say that. And then I asked him about that, and he also said he also wanted to know if you not like currently, like right now, but he wants to know if you can play War Ensemble by Slayer, and he has a feeling that you can.
Yes, but not right now.
Exactly.
I haven't played that song in a long time. I got a funny story about War Ensemble really quickly.
For sure. He's going to be thrilled. Go for it.
I got a stereo. I got a stereo in high school, and I think this was, let me see, Seasons in the Abyss came out in 1990, so it was like maybe a year after that.
Okay.
But I got a new stereo and had this alarm function.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, okay, cool, I'll set the alarm. And I totally, like, I don't know what, I programmed it wrong, but I set it for like 4 a.m. and I left the volume super high, and I had Seasons in the Abyss in my CD deck, and 4 a.m. happens to dun, 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 dun. Like, shit. Anyway, that woke me up out of bed real quick.
That's awesome.
Full volume out of the stereo.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm forgetting exactly where we were. We were talking about West Coast IPA and kind of some of those bullet points on
Yeah.
there. Did you touch on everything that you wanted to touch on there?
I think so. I would go ahead and here's my not so shameless plug, but West Coast IPA is now a codified category with the Brewers Association.
Okay. Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
So
Hey, so
I had the honor of working on a panel with the BA to come up with those guidelines, and they, like all guidelines, are ever evolving. But I felt it was absolutely due for becoming its own codified style. And every year when they ask for feedback from judges, like I would say, please make West Coast a category, please, 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 every year. And finally they hit me up and they said, okay, we're going to consider this. We'd really like to make it a category. Who else do you want to, like, would you be part of a panel to kind of decide some style guidelines? And I said, I'd be honored, like, yes, please. And we brought in Ben Edmonds and then Vinny Chilurzo to kind of help chisel out those guidelines.
Sure.
But in the discussions, we all agreed that the style should be dry. It should have little to no crystal malt character, moderate hop bitterness. But the dryness is really kind of one of those things that's important, and the clarity too, for sure.
Are you driving? Are you driving that dryness in the mash or with your grist build with simple sugar? How are you driving that dryness, or is it a function potentially of that well attenuating 001 that you're using?
It's the well attenuating 001. It's also our grist. It's 2-row. We're not using any dextrose in our core IPAs. We certainly do in double IPAs.
Yeah.
And then our mash temp is fairly modest, but it's at 150 degrees, which some people might consider on the cooler side.
Yep.
But we're not looking really for any dextrinous characteristics in that all.
Yeah.
We want to give that yeast a full, easy pathway to attenuate super dry, so that when we dry hop it, we see minimal re-fermentation.
Yeah. Yeah. How long is that mash rest for your saccharification rest?
It is, let me see, it takes us about 20 minutes to mash in, and then we rest for an additional 20 minutes, and then we typically boil out for 30 to 45 minutes before we start sending it to the kettle. So really in reality, it's anywhere from 60 to 75 minutes.
Sure.
But most of the conversion is fully done well before then. And so perhaps the total time that it actually sits at around 150 degrees, the enzymes are able to chisel away at those dextrins even longer. Yeah.
Yeah. You when we were talking about this lingering bitterness with West Coast IPA, I think I think it's interesting, and it is a key point that I want to drill home for people that are listening to this. The impression of this beer is very much, well, and really all the beers we're trying to put together and striking whatever balance we're trying to create. When you're making a beer that dry, that's gonna have a serious impact on multiple factors, right? One of them being impression of bitterness. So you're making these really dry, pale West Coast beers. And what do you find is, we talked about it before, like the bitterness that we're adding to the kettle or at various stages. What bitterness level are you looking at generating in those beers to kind of have that long bitter finish that you're looking for? Do you have a sweet spot for that? Is a certain percentage of that coming from, I believe you mentioned a CO2 extract for bittering. Is there a certain bittering number that you're looking to hit in beers like that to kind of create that through line?
Well, I will say on paper, most of our West Coast IPAs are anywhere from 60 to 70 IBUs on paper. And they usually test anywhere between 50 and like 58 actual IBUs in the lab. And also most of our West Coast IPAs at this point have evolved to be a bittering addition with that CO2 extract, and then a moderate whirlpool addition, anywhere from half a pound to 3/4 of a pound per barrel of T90 in the whirlpool. And so that typically gets us a fairly firm bitterness. But I would also point out that hops are not the only way that you can adjust bitterness. Acidity is a way to influence bitterness in general. The higher your acidity, the more your acidic beer, more acidic your beer is, the softer your hops present. But the other thing too is the more you increase sulfates, the more intense your bitterness seems. And so for us, we also add gypsum and acid at whirlpool for a lot of our West Coast IPAs, because the acidity and the ultimate like sulfate levels that we're looking for in finished beer exist in a different space than what we are looking for in the mash.
Sure.
And this is something that I got from Sierra Nevada. They've been doing it for decades. So Sierra Nevada Pale Ale famously gets a gypsum addition in the mash, and then again at the whirlpool.
Yeah. So you got my head buzzing on a couple of things. So for typical West Coast IPAs, you're going to be getting a CO2 extract in at 60. Is there a ballpark on the bittering level you want to get from that charge? Oh wait, maybe you already said it. I maybe I'm making you repeat.
No, in fact, well, so for example, with a lot of the CO2 extract that we're typically getting anywhere from 45 to 50 calculated IBUs in the bittering charge.
Sure.
And then whirlpool, it's really kind of hard to quantify that.
Yes.
You do absolutely get IBUs from that. And our whirlpool charges are anywhere from 15 to 25 theoretical IBUs.
Yeah. Dude, you've got some baller ass hop selection going on. If that's the volumes that you're using, well, I mean, obviously it's the volumes you're using, but like I know folks that are layering in a lot more into the whirlpool and chasing a lot more on that side.
Sure.
That's impressive, man, and it speaks to selection, and I said we would come back to this. Buddy of mine, Andy, actually brews over there at Linwood, dear friend of mine. He said when selecting Citra, because I had heard you speak about this in the research that I was doing on some other listening to other podcasts that you've been on. You had referenced the fact that you have a 2 pound per barrel dry hop, but it is because of the hops you're able to select and how robust those hops are as far as delivering flavor and aroma.
Game changer.
Yeah. And so Andy asked, when selecting Citra specifically, what are the attributes that you're looking for with that particular hop on the table? I think sometimes because like there's a line between doing a rub at a table and then the beer, the hop expressing in the finished beer. Can you give us some of your thoughts on that?
Sure. And I will say it's different for every varietal. And Citra has been the most difficult hop for me to learn to correlate rub versus final pellet. Of the hops that we select the most, like Mosaic, Simcoe, CTZ, Equinaut, those are fairly easy for me to predict. I've correlated my sensibilities there where I can rub the hop and be like, okay, I know what this is going to smell like in a pellet. Citra has been the most challenging for me. The qualities that I want out of a pellet seem to exist in a slightly different space than where the rub does. But in general, I like Citra that is slightly later pick. With a lot of my hops, I like slightly later pick because it gets me a little bit of that dankness. And so with Citra, I'm looking for kind of 3 major components. I'm looking for bright tangerine. I'm looking for a little bit of tropical fruit, but I'm also looking for that kind of slightly burning dank resin.
Yeah, that's interesting. I need to. I don't know. It's just exciting. There's so much. I don't know. there's it's one of the things that keeps me fired up. And first of all, conversations like this, hopefully you're not feeling as if I'm coming at you completely scatterbrained, because this is
No,
what
this
I
is
do.
fun.
This is what I do when I have enjoyable beer conversations.
Sure.
I just start getting multiple questions at once, and then I have to try to sort them out and remember what the hell I'm talking about in the meantime. So yeah, that's really interesting. I did want to jump into just briefly. We mentioned lagers, and I'm such a sucker for lagers. We do a lot of lager at Sonder, which is exciting for me. I'm looking forward to continuing to dive into that a little bit more deeply. So I do have a little lager talk for you, and then I have
Sure.
a couple of quick questions, and I do want to respect your time, so I won't keep you here all day. But
Sure.
let's talk lager for a second. You did mention that Beachwood has some lagers that you like to have on tap. Tell me a little bit about the lager program that you have going there at Beachwood.
We always have a couple lagers on tap, but the one year-round lager that is always available is called Hayabusa, and that is inspired by one of my favorite beers of all time, Asahi Dry.
Mm.
And that was a beer I drank plenty of in college when it was still available in those 2-liter screw top cans with a handle on them. I don't know if you remember those,
Mm-hmm.
but that's a year-round lager for us. And the characteristics we're trying to get out of that beer, we really want it to taste like a macro lager.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I necessarily want it to taste craft-like, and so we use multiple enzymes in that beer to get it crazy dry.
Mm-hmm.
It's usually 95 to 97% attenuated. There's a good amount of dextrose in that beer. There's alpha amylase in the mash. There's Clarex with the yeast. We ferment at a slightly warmer temperature, and we also do use the Modelo strain in that beer. So there's a notable component of isoamyl in that beer.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as much. It's more than you would get in Modelo, but it's not as much as you would get in, say, Coors.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's another thing that is kind of perpetuated in some circles, is that lagers have no esters.
Mm-hmm.
They have less esters than ales, and essentially they have no ester profile. That's not true. In fact, there are several studies done. There are a lot of technical papers specifically on how to carve and sculpt your isoamyl banana characteristic in your lager.
Mm-hmm.
And Coors banquet beer, I love that beer. That is a huge banana component to it.
Yeah.
Big isoamyl. And that part of that's the strain. Part of that is their fermentation temperature.
Mm-hmm.
Modelo has a component to that too. And I like the isoamyl component to kind of exist between the two, halfway between Coors and Modelo.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going for, we're using a different strain. We're using the Modelo strain, but we're probably fermenting a lot of our lagers warmer than people might expect.
Mm-hmm.
Then if I use that strain in something like a German Pilsner, where I don't want it to be ester driven, then I will pitch a slightly larger volume, and then I'll ferment the beer at cooler temperatures, like high 40s or very low 50s.
Sure. The light lager that you were just talking about, is that beer water backed?
It is on the hot side. So typically when we brew that beer, we'll do 2 high gravity turns, and then we will fill our boil kettle with hot water, and then basically run it through our whirlpool and heat exchanger. And that's the final third of the total volume. So if we were brewing a 60 barrel batch, 40 barrels would be high gravity wort, 20 barrels would be water.
Mm-hmm. Do you find, I know sometimes people take that approach, and sometimes people will just will just ferment out the high gravity lager and then water back on the cold side?
And we've done that too. And I will say that almost all macro lagers are done that way. And there are artifacts of that in all of those macro lagers. When you taste, at least when I taste, a lot of those macro lagers, there's a certain higher alcohol component I find very pleasing, but it's there that I don't get in a lot of craft-like a lot of craft brewers say, "Oh, I'm gonna clone my favorite lawnmower lager,"
Yeah.
and that kind of higher alcohol ester component is missing.
Yeah.
'Cause I think they might overthink it in the wrong way.
Mhm.
We tried doing that, and not a lot of lager yeast likes to ferment to 8 or 9% and be repitched.
Mhm. Mhm.
But the larger breweries, the big macro breweries have much tighter yeast programs, and they have
Sure.
huge propagation tanks, and they have the means to make that happen on a regular basis.
Mhm.
But on the smaller scale, that's really tough. But we have done it that way before, where we brewed an 8% lager and then watered back post fermentation with de-aerated water.
Yep. Yep.
And it did create that kind of higher alcohol component that we were looking for, that was then kind of counterbalanced by watering it back.
Mhm.
But what we ultimately found was that picking the right strain and then doing a slightly warmer fermentation and then increasing the amount of simple sugars in the beer
Mhm.
would get us to pretty much the same place.
Yeah. Yeah, man. It's interesting. There's so many levers and dials. It's one of those things that keeps you hungry and coming back for it.
That sounds like a
Um,
good name for a nightclub, Levers and Dials.
Speaking of good names,
Yeah.
I will say one of my all-time favorite things is, so I do a monthly Q&A podcast, and so I get a lineup of real characters in the chat room, and somebody corrected me because I've been over the last couple of years with the lager brewing I'm doing and different things like that, and I've gotten more into bunging tanks holding more carbonation from fermentation, X, Y, and Z, right?
Mhm.
And so I talked about bunging, and I talked about spunding, and I've been corrected aggressively by many people that I should be saying spoonding, okay, instead of spunding. And I recognize that there's a line between American and German, and I could
Sure.
be saying that, but I also know that I should be saying wird rather than wort. All right, or something in the range. So I have a username in here from a listener who's he's adopted the name Spoonding und Wort, and he asks about milk stout. He
Sure.
said, have you spoken about milk stouts and lactose additions? If not, kind of what do you target percentage wise for lactose on sweet stout?
Ours, Utter Love, which we brew a couple times a year, that
Mhm.
has roughly 6%. In fact, I've got because I'm so old school, I still have Pro Mash on my computer.
Hell yeah, man!
I've been able to migrate that over on a USB drive, but
That's fantastic.
oh yeah, right, old school. But hold on a sec here. I will tell you exactly what the lactose percentage is in that beer, but it's typically 6%. And here we go. So if people want to know what's in Utter Love, Utter Love is okay. It's higher. It's 7.5%
Okay.
lactose.
Mm-hmm.
But that's been one of Beachwood's most successful beers in competitions over the years. It's done very well for us. It was originally inspired by Left Hand Milk Stout, which I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of people would
Yeah,
argue is
yeah,
still the
yeah,
industry standard for
yeah,
milk stout.
yeah.
It's still my favorite. Every time I have that beer, I'm like, damn, I gotta go back and tweak
Dude,
this.
is Mackeson's still a thing? Because I came up drinking Mackeson's because Mackeson's was listed as one of the in the old BJCP guideline. It was listed as one of the classic examples of the style. Did you guys ever have that imported over there?
I had Mackesons in England in the mid
Oh,
90s,
okay, okay,
like fairly fresh.
yeah.
And my recollection of the beer was that it was nice, but not quite, I think, as full bodied as where most American judges want to see that beer these days.
Mm.
So some of
Love
that
that.
also depends on whether or not you're competing the beer and World Beer Cup or
Yes.
GABF. But
Yeah.
Utter Love as a milk stout has performed equally well in both competitions.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and
But
that's one thing that I didn't mention, but I mean, yeah, I mean, you have a list of awards as long as my arm. Now, and you hit on something that I think is so key. I remember when I was home brewing and competing on the homebrew side, I was finding like, okay, well, let me do milk stout because I can riff off that too, and so I would do variations of it, like adjuncted variations, and I had a batch that did not ferment as much as I thought it would.
mhm,
And dude, it crushed. Okay. And I'm like, oh, I'm so far. My residual sweetness is so high. I'm going to be screwed. And that was probably one of the better performing beers. Cause what I would do is I would make 5 gallons, bottle 2 cases, and then basically all I would do is enter those beers in competition. I almost
sure.
never drank my homebrew. Like I enter competitions like a madman. And yeah, so residual sweetness on a beer like that. Do you mind saying what kind of residual sweetness you end up having in a milk stout?
Sure. We're typically on that beer, we're typically somewhere around 4 to 4.5 Plato. But what
Mhm.
I will say with competitions too is that if you, I think a lot of people get a little gun shy when it comes to using lactose in a milk stout. They might not use that much. They might also be afraid to layer on the higher mash temp on top of the use of
Yeah,
lactose.
yeah, yeah.
And so their beer is probably comes out, nice and pleasant, but maybe somewhat drier than it should be. And so
Mhm.
you've got these beers that are entered in a competition. They're maybe a little bit drier than they should be.
Uh-huh.
And the ones maybe where people are a little bit braver and willing to take the chance have the higher mouthfeel that just kind of stands above. Like
Uh-huh.
those are the ones that just immediately click without thinking too much, where the judges are like, ooh, this one's more substantial.
Sure, sure.
Like, oh, these other beers are suddenly thinner than this one.
How
And
much do you
so,
think yeast strain is playing a role in that? Because in my understanding, and this is going to be butchered a little bit, but there's some yeast strains that produce is it glycerin or glycerol more
glycerol, yeah.
than others, right? So is yeast playing? Do you feel as if yeast selection for a beer like this can play a role, or is yeah? What's your thought on that?
Well, you know what yeast essentially produces like no meaningful glycerol, and especially in low ABV beers, is cal ale.
Sure.
A yeast that produces a high amount of glycerol is French saison,
Sure.
and other saison strains that get beer like crazy dry, but
Hmm.
don't have thin mouthfeel.
Hmm.
But Utter Love has always been brewed with cal ale,
Yeah.
and every time it's done well in a competition,
Yeah.
it's cal ale.
Yeah.
And that's a yeast strain that I think does extremely well with dry, pale, hoppy styles. I think it does really well in stouts because I think there are certain components that you're getting from the roast malt and certain like aldehyde, not acid aldehyde, but aldehyde precursors that you might get from dark crystal malts
Hmm.
that are converted into a pleasant fruitiness in darker beers. And then I think cal and cal derivatives can kind of have trouble finding a middle zone in anything that is maybe amber colored. Like you can brew an ESB with cal ale
Hmm.
and it's fine.
Hmm.
But I think it's going to be missing that fruitiness that you would get out of a traditional English strain, like maybe something from Fuller's.
Hmm.
But when you push cal ale into something like an oatmeal stout or a milk stout or an imperial stout, I think it indexes to a different flavor profile.
Mm.
It works really well.
Mhm.
So Utter Love has always had White Labs cal ale in it whenever it's medaled at World Beer Cup and GABF. In fact, that's the only yeast we've ever used in that beer.
That's
So
awesome.
yeah,
Well, Julian, listen, man, this is great, and I'm gonna run into my time limit here, but there's I've This was awesome, dude. And I just
Well,
wanted
thank
to,
you. It's an honor to be on.
yeah, I wanted to thank you. Just great conversation. And if you just want to give anybody a shout out on where they can either, see what you have going on online, or Beachwood, or anything that we should be looking out for Beachwood in 2024.
Please always follow Beachwood's Instagram, Beachwood Brewing, Beachwood Blendery, Beachwood HB, short for Huntington Beach, which is our pizzeria. And my plug for that is we mill our own flour. It's a 48-hour sourdough ferment. And as a cool tie-in to everything else that Beachwood does, our sourdough culture is our blendery house culture that drives our entire sour beer program. So that's my plug. Buy Beachwood beer whenever you can. We crank it out fresh. Our distributors are really, really good to us, and they place it very fresh and quickly. And then if you're looking for that complete food experience, come to our pizzeria in Huntington Beach. We thought really long and hard about the name, and we ultimately settled on Beachwood Pizza and Beer.
Nice. Love it.
So anyway, that's the name of the place. That's what we do. But yeah, that's my plug for Beachwood. But Adam, it's been a pleasure. It's been really fun.
Dude, man, that's awesome. And one more plug, I will say, if you have a Master Brewers Association sign-in membership, jump on and dig back in Technical Quarterly and read the article that Julien put together on barrel aging. And I don't think this is one of those things where it doesn't matter if your barrel aging program is killer and you love exactly how it's coming out. It's so well written, detailed, and explains why things are going on, or why this approach is being used. It's worth it to read and just put in your tool belt. And honestly, that article fires me up so much, because it's good. It does exactly what articles like that are supposed to do. It's like, this is what we're doing. This is why we do it, right? And it's never the approach of like, oh, this is the way. It's like, no, this is what we do to try to mitigate this and this risk, right? And then we have found that this works well with this works well with this, and I love stuff like that. So Julien, if you have not checked it out, check that article out. And Julien, as always, just super grateful to have you on. To all of the listeners out there, please give a shout out to Blickman, our wonderful sponsor. Hit up that merch store if you want some silly things to buy to support the channel. And I will be seeing you in early March already. Holy cow, for the March question and answer live stream. So Julien, once again, man, thanks so much. And I hope you all have a good night.
Thank you, Adam. Appreciate it. Cheers.
Cheers.